Hi folks, Seth Leapson here. Thanks for watching my monologue. In these uncertain times, you may be thinking about personal protection. If you are, I urge you to visit my friends at Guns Etc. They'll help you find the perfect protection for yourself and your family, and they can even teach you how to use it. They've been protecting Arizonans for over 33 years, and they stand for the great principles this country was founded upon. Or you can just click on gunsetcetera.com. And if you like my monologues, please subscribe to 960 The Patriots YouTube channel. Welcome back and happy December 21st, 2020. In 1943, Chief Justice of the U.S. Supreme Court Harlan Fiske Stone, and placed as Chief Justice by Franklin Delano Roosevelt, wrote, quote, "Distinctions between citizens solely because of their ancestry are by their very nature odious to a free people whose institutions are founded upon the doctrine of equality." Close quote. 10 years later, Thurgood Marshall wrote in his brief on behalf of the NAACP for Brown versus Board of Education, quote, "Distinctions by race are so evil, so arbitrary and invidious that a state bound to defend the equal protection of the laws must not invoke them in any public sphere." Close quote. 10 years after that, John F. Kennedy said, quote, "It ought to be possible here for every American to enjoy the privileges of being American without regard to his race or his color. In short, every American ought to have the right to be treated as he would wish to be treated, as one would wish his children to be treated." Close quote. A little more than a decade after that, the Supreme Court wrote in the Bakke decision, quote, "It is far too late to argue that the guarantee of equal protection to all persons permits the recognition of special wards entitled to a degree of protection greater than that accorded others." Close quote. And yet, here today, when someone is asked on television or elsewhere what makes Xavier Becerra qualified to be the Secretary of Health and Human Services or Marcia Fudge to be the Secretary of Housing and Urban Development, when asked about their qualifications, without batting an eye, the first answer from any expert or politico is something close to, well, they fulfill a racial category, or they represent the fill-in-the-blank community, close quote. In other words, the first answer is that their race qualifies them. The person answering doesn't think twice about it, and the person asking the question doesn't think twice about the answer. It's just a rational decision because it's a decision based on race, and that's what we do here now. The merits and the qualifications never come up. I say it's what we do here now. It's what a lot of people do here now, and what probably more will be forced to do here now. Why do we do that? Why do a lot of people do that now? Historical discrimination is certainly one answer. Diversity is another, but neither of these claims are ever examined. If historical discrimination is the reason, do we ever ask what these achieved individuals experienced as discrimination? If diversity is the answer, do we ever ask why diversity itself is important and if it's more important than the job? Let's take Health and Human Services. It's a department, obviously, having to do with public health. Has anyone ever thought when it came to their individual health that the race of the doctor was the most important or decisive factor in hiring them? If you had need for brain surgery some years ago and you could choose between Ben Carson and Michael DeBakey, Carson being one of the most respected brain surgeons in the world, who is also black, DeBakey being one of the most famous heart surgeons in the world, who was white, who would you choose for your brain surgeon? If you had need for heart surgery, would you choose Carson or DeBakey? Would you ask Carson's team or DeBakey's team how many minorities were going to be part of the surgical team? Would that be important to you at all? Take housing. When you pay your rent, is it important that your apartment owner or rent collector is a certain color, or do you want a functioning domicile that is kept up? In the education of your children, if you could have Saul Khan or Jaime Escalante as your child's math teacher or tutor, who would you choose? Sal is of Indian descent, Escalante Hispanic. Both award-winning math teachers, but what slot of diversity do you want or would they fill for you? Would it matter to you? Or what if the choice was some other teacher unknown to the world and not as good as Khan or Escalante, but of African American or Native American descent? Your child never having had a Native American teacher before, perhaps you would choose that person over Escalante or Khan. That would be diversity in education, wouldn't it? I say perhaps you would, when of course you know and I know you would not. Because when it comes to you, your circumstances, your family, your children, diversity is actually, upon examination, maybe one of the least important goals. Success and excellence would rather top the list. Ability to get it done well. But some will say it's an important societal goal, if not an individual goal. Very well. Why? Historical neglect and or discrimination, perhaps. To be sure, but what was the basis for the historical neglect and discrimination? The basis for it was, in the words of Chief Justice Stone, as in the words of Thurgood Marshall, distinctions based on race. And in those days, the distinctions were made against anyone who was not Caucasian. But was it wrong because we knew deep down that Asian is ipso facto more qualitative than Caucasian, or that black was ipso facto more qualitative than Caucasian? Or was it wrong because we were saying ipso facto Caucasian was either more qualitative than either, or if not more qualitative, just what we did, because we thought lesser of other races and ethnicities? Harvard famously did this with Jews, putting a cap, a quota, on how many could be admitted in a given year, or as well as other Ivy Leagues. Deep down, we all kind of knew it was wrong, even if we didn't admit it, because A, we knew it was simply wrong, and B, we knew what societies dedicated to that wrong-headedness could do with it in the extreme, be it slavery or a concentration camp. Why did we know it was simply wrong? Well, there's a lot to infer from that question. I guess, first of all, it's because it's unnatural. Nobody is born thinking one skin color or another determines or means anything. As the old song goes from South Pacific, you have to be carefully taught to hate. Biblically, we know we all came from one human and we have no concept of his race. It simply never mattered, neither to nature nor to God, or to people not carefully taught that it mattered. To wit, if I may borrow from Rav Aurora, somebody forgot to tell Japanese Americans that they could not own land in parts of America, and though they were interned here in our parents' and grandparents' lifetimes, they shouldn't be able to succeed here. Somehow that memo didn't get to them. Someone forgot to tell them because their income disparities with Caucasian Americans disappeared a decade and a half after all that ended. And today, Japanese Americans outperform whites by large margins in income statistics, education outcomes, test scores, and incarceration rates. Someone also forgot to tell Pakistani Americans, Lebanese Americans, South African Americans, Filipino Americans, Sri Lankan Americans, and Iranian Americans, because they all out-earn Caucasians here too. But African Americans do not, you say. Well, somebody forgot to tell Nigerians, Barbadians, Ghanaians, Trinidadians, and Tobagonians here because their household incomes also outrun Caucasian incomes. But here we are, more than 2 generations after the Thurgood Marshall position in Brown v. Board, and 4 years after a 2-term elected African-American president, being told that institutional racism in America and white privilege must be addressed wholesale with diversity selections for positions and reserved spots in employment and education, because evidently we don't believe judging people by race is wrong here anymore. We now believe distinctions between citizens solely because of their ancestry are by their very nature critically important to a free people whose institutions are founded upon the doctrine of equality, we are told, aren't we? In other words, freedom and equality must now stand for neither freedom of thought nor equality of citizenship based on the common condition of being human, but based on the notion that white equals bad. And more must be atoned for. This is what we see when we talk about white privilege and having to apologize for. It's what we see in the school curricula in Seattle, as much as in schools in New York, as much as at the Smithsonian with their anti-whiteness project. Take the Dalton School in New York, one of the most privileged schools in America. Tuition, elementary through secondary, over $50,000 a year. A series of proposals for that school includes these, quoting from the New York Post: hiring 12 full-time diversity officers and multiple psychologists to support students coping with race-based traumatic stress, assigning a staffer dedicated to black students who have complaints or face disciplinary action, and a full-time advocate to help black kids navigate a predominantly white institution, paying the student debt of black staffers upon hiring them, requiring courses that focus on black liberation and challenges to white supremacy, compensating any student of color who appears in Dalton promotional material, abolishing high-level academic courses by 2023 if the performance of black students is not on par with non-blacks. Now, it would seem to me that last one would in and of itself carry a mark of discrimination by assumption about one particular race. It also seems to me tuition for everyone will go up, especially with 12 new hires for the position of diversity officer. I wonder, by the way, what a diversity officer does or will do. The notion of it kind of frightens me. Call it a race officer. That's what other regimes have had, an authority or authoritarian enforcer whose job it is to enforce racial consciousness, compliance, and, of course, punishment. This is the world we now live in, and it's getting worse. If you think that sort of thing bad or odious even, it's getting worse. A modern-day race consciousness. But the history of this country is one that runs a common thread that began in 1776 with a promise and ethic of equality, all the way through the speeches and writings of Abraham Lincoln and the deeds of the Union soldiers in the Civil War to the kind of case law and dicta I opened this monologue with. Which is precisely why, to get to a modern-day race consciousness, all of that has to be excised and cut out from our history. Now you can understand why the Smithsonian has a campaign against whiteness and San Francisco is taking Abraham Lincoln's name off of school. For the only way to understand our new ethic is to erase any semblance or history of our old ones. Too bad the old ones we've come to venerate taught us rightly, and the new ones teach us so poorly. Knowing our history, it turns out, is not always a march forward. Distorted, it can be a march backward. It can even be an invention of things we used to abhor. There's a meme that was put up on the Huffington Post website reading this, quote, "Is coffee racist? How drinking coffee perpetuates white supremacy. The black beverage is created by black people for black people. As a white person drinking coffee, you are oppressing BIPOC, people of color." You know what's weird about that? I'm old enough to remember learning about the Greensboro Four black college students who helped start the modern civil rights movement by demanding they be served coffee at a segregated counter in North Carolina. Now it's whites who can't drink coffee? We're depriving people their drinking of coffee because of their skin color again? I guess Thurgood Marshall was wrong. Distinctions by race aren't so evil, so arbitrary and invidious after all. I'm Seth Leibson. We'll be right back.